What was really important was that each of the tribes were putting their faith and trust in God. Wherever God has placed us, wherever He's placed us in life, what's really important is that we fear Him, we trust Him. Where He places us is up to Him. How we respond to Him, that's in our court. But please have your Bibles open again to Numbers chapter 2. When we were in Numbers 1 last week, we saw the initial numbering of the tribes, God's people. We know that a few hundred years earlier, about 70 souls came from Canaan into Egypt. 70. Not a big number. That might be maybe a few less than what we have here today. 70 people left Canaan to Egypt. And a few hundred years later, there are over 600,000 fighting men. And you extrapolate, they're married, they have some children, etc., etc. And that's why we're talking over a couple of million people that would form the nation of Israel. Sadly, all but two of those over 600,000 men who were numbered and who are numbered in chapter 2 would die in the wilderness. And in Numbers chapter 2 today, we are introduced to the tribes and the numbering of each of the tribes and where they would camp in relation to the tabernacle. We saw that God would have a different strategy when it came to his people conquering the promised land. He had delivered them miraculously out of Egypt, but this time he would expect them to fight. He'd expect them to get involved. He had saved them out of Egypt, and their ultimate conquest of the promised land would certainly involve their faith in God and their trust in God, but they would have to roll up their sleeves, grab a sword, and be involved in the fighting. I thought of Philippians 2 when Paul tells the believers, he says, "Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but also in my absence," he said in verse 12 of Philippians 2, "Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling." Work it out. Live it out. Live out what God began in you. But then he says in verse 13, "For it is God who works in you both to will and to do for his good pleasure." Yes, God is at work as well. And I don't claim to understand all the ins and outs of that, but God is at work and he wants us to work and to trust in him. He doesn't want our minds in neutral. We've got to get it in gear. I suppose that's one advantage of learning to drive a manual. I had to learn that as a teenager if I had any hope of, driving mum's car. Even to this day, she drives manuals, And I can still drive a manual very reluctantly. I find it very irritating, especially some of those really steep streets around Sydney when we go there. You got to manage the clutch and the brake, and gets very I get very nervous. Prefer those automatics, but of course, in an automatic vehicle, you can kind of switch off a little bit, if you know what I'm saying, not too much. Having a manual involves you being much more active in the process of driving. Well, the Lord wanted his people to be involved in this conquest. They would shed some blood in the possession of the land. In 1 Corinthians 3, Paul says, "We are God's fellow workers." God works and we work. God will do his part, and he wants us to do our part. And we have in chapter 2 a description of how the 12 tribes would arrange themselves as they would move toward the promised land. We saw last week the need for obedience. Look at verse 54 of Numbers 1. Thus the children of Israel did according to all that the Lord commanded Moses, so they did. And then look at chapter 2, verse 34. Thus the children of Israel did according to all that the Lord commanded Moses. Someone said that Christ's sheep are marked in the ear and the foot. They hear his voice and they follow him. Someone else said, if God has called you, don't spend your time looking over your shoulder to see who is following. Imagine if Caleb and Joshua had allowed the majority view to shape and colour their own heart and response. But think about the logistics of moving so many people. So many people. You had the pillar of cloud over the tribes during the day, the pillar of fire by night, and as the cloud or the fire moved, the tribes would all move in unison. That takes some skill. That takes some planning. It'd be impossible to move the camp and to march quickly and efficiently without some kind of order. I mean, even today, warehouses have managers and supervisors that are just focused on the movement of people and the movement of machinery and the movement of the forklifts. Even in fully automated warehouses, you need people on the floor looking around, making sure that things are moving in the right direction. Even in my own lifetime, there might be a soccer match somewhere in one part of the world and some gates haven't opened properly and there's too many people, and then there's panic, and then there is death, even in my own lifetime. Because someone wasn't planning the mass movements of people. And so God does things decently and in order. And in the middle of the camp was the tabernacle, or the tent of meeting, the very presence of God. And this was a visual reminder that God's people would move when he moved, but as he led them, so he was with them. He was above them through the cloud, but he was in the middle in the tent. God is with us today. We have his promises, and yet we have his own presence. We have his own presence. In fact, believers today have a local church family that they can come to. And so we have God's presence in many different aspects. Surely we have no excuse. We cannot say that we are less ably led today than were the children of Israel in the wilderness. God hasn't left us wondering, bewildered as to how we should live for him, how we should serve him today. And so you had these 12 tribes, and I want to just think for a moment, who were the 12 tribes historically? Because initially, these tribes began with 12 men. Began literally with 12 men. We go back to Jacob. He was Abraham's grandson and the son of Isaac. Jacob had a twin by the name of Esau. Jacob had two wives, Leah and Rachel, and of course there's a story to all of these things that I've told you. And Leah and Rachel each gave Jacob one of their personal handmaidens as a sort of a lesser wife, didn't quite have the same status as they enjoyed. And from these 4 women, Jacob would bear 12 sons and 1 daughter. This was the beginning of the 12 tribes. Not particularly savoury, not the best way to have 12 tribes, not the best way to do it. But that's how it was. God doesn't, give us a history in the Old Testament that sort of airbrushes a couple of women out of the story. Gives us the full picture that even despite human sin and folly, God is going to call a people for his name. From Leah, he gets 6 sons. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun. He gets his only daughter Dinah from Leah, and this is a woman he never wanted to marry. This is one that he wasn't real enthusiastic about, so to speak. And she felt it. She knew it. And he knew it. It was no secret. Not the happiest union, but certainly a very fruitful union. We have other children who came. Think about Rachel, the one that he really loved. Well, Rachel gave him her handmaiden, Bilhah, and she gave Jacob Dan and Naphtali. And then Leah, that first wife, she had a handmaiden, Zilpah, and she gave Jacob 2 sons, Gad and Asher. So all these sort of kids coming into the world, but they're special. They're going to form the basis of the tribes and then really the nation of Israel. And then, of course, from Rachel, there was Joseph. He features greatly in the book of Genesis. Though he doesn't have a tribe of his own, it's going to come to 2 of his sons. And then there was Benjamin, the 12th son. It's been said that Jacob's family was full of problems and potential. Half of his sons were born to Leah, a woman, again, that he had no particular love for and no real intention of marrying. He married her because of a fraud from his father-in-law. And this had ramifications for years and years between them. And yet from Leah came Levi, from which tribe the priests would come, and from Judah, from which Jesus Christ would come. You'd expect it would come from Rachel, but no, it's going to come through Leah. So Rachel bore him 2 final and favourite sons. Joseph would, of course, become the most famous chapter after chapter in the book of Genesis. That's how these tribes began. It began all the wrong way. Not how it's supposed to be, but welcome to humanity. Welcome to humanity. It never quite goes according to plan because sin gets into everything. Sin has the potential of ruining everything, except God has an eternal plan. He never condones sin. It should have been done better, should have been done trusting him, but not even human departures can frustrate God's eternal purposes. And so you have these tribes historically, and what we find in Numbers 2, and you'll probably thank me for not reading from 4 through to 32, but you have a numbering of all of the tribes and how big they were, and essentially you have the tribes at different points around the camp according to their birth. For instance, we have Judah, Issachar and Zebulun, descendants of Leah. They are going to be east of the camp. Over 186,000 fighting men. They're near the entrance of the tabernacle, and so you want the largest numbers of soldiers protecting a potential area of attack. You have Simeon, Reuben and Gad of Leah or her handmaid. They're camping south, just over 150,000 men. You have Ephraim and Manasseh. These were the sons of Joseph. Remember, he names them after he receives his promotion, is given an Egyptian wife, and he has his own family. He has two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and they will become two of the 12 tribes of Israel. They are west, just over 100,000 men. The descendants of Rachel camped together on the north side, Dan, Asher, and then Naphtali, some of the concubines, with over 150,000 men. And so they are situated according to their mothers, and situated around size and the best use of their military strength and numbering. Now, they had to be careful, of course, they didn't get too close to the tabernacle, because even if they got too close, it would be vulnerable to a judgment of the Lord. To get too close to the tent meant certain death. And every tribe we see, and if you look at chapter 2, verse 2, look at verse 2 with me. Every one of the children of Israel shall camp by his own standard, or we could say by his own banner, beside the emblems of his father's house. They were identified by some kind of colouring of the tribal banners, kind of like their representative banner, just like teams that we follow. Now, we have a bit of tradition, some Jewish tradition that says that, maybe the colours they had were like the 12 gems of the high priest's breastplate. Well, that makes some sense, but we don't know. Or there's another tradition that says that it followed from the book of Ezekiel and later Revelation, the banner of a lion to Judah, an ox to Ephraim, a man to Reuben, an eagle to Gad, that kind of thing. But we're not sure what the standard was, how they were identified. But I think of the way that God blesses us today. I think of Psalm 20, verse 5. We will rejoice in your salvation, and in the name of our God, we will set up our banners. May the Lord fulfill all your petitions. Whatever the banner was, whatever the standard was, whatever the colour was, it would be set up in the name of God. In Psalm 60, verse 4, you have given a banner to those who fear you, that it may be displayed because of the truth. What was really important was that each of the tribes were putting their faith and trust in God. Wherever God has placed us, wherever he's placed us in life, what's really important is that we fear him, we trust him. Where he places us is up to him. How we respond to him, that's in our court. That's how we need to relate to God. The prophet Balaam would look at the camps in Numbers 24 and he'd say, how beautiful are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. Like valleys they spread out, like gardens beside a river, like aloes planted by the Lord, like cedars beside the waters. This was an incredible sight. And imagine for a moment, the pillar of cloud starts moving and they start to pack up the tabernacle. This was for the Levites. And all the tribes begin to pack up their tents and to get the supplies and to get in marching order, to gather the women and the children. Think about them moving, following that cloud. And let me read this to you, this hymn we sing very often. When we walk with the Lord in the light of his word, what a glory he sheds on our way. Now they saw that physically, but we can have the same experience personally. While we do his good will, he abides with us still, and with all who will trust and obey. One writer said this about the camp of Israel in Numbers 2. He says it's an illustration of what we ought to be in this world. A pilgrim people following the Lord, with his glory at heart of everything and his presence leading the way. A pilgrim people. That's Hebrews 11. Pilgrims declare that they are seeking a better country whose builder and maker is God. And friends, whatever we have in this world, it's really just like a tent that's very, very temporary and can go at any moment. The writer says Israel was one people united in the Lord and to one another. Yet each separate company was recognized by God, displayed its own unique banner, occupied its own special place, and marched at the Lord's command. Now, I think there's something that we can learn today from this picture of Numbers 2. Every tribe, every group had their place that God decided upon. They didn't get to choose where they got to be. And human nature being what it is, there would have been someone in each tribe who thought, we really should have been somewhere else. We get much better shade over there. We're much more closer to the action over there. Why do we always miss out on the good places? Human nature being what it is. We read from 1 Corinthians 12, where verse 18 says, "But now God has set the members, each one of them, in the body just as he pleased." And so if you're here at Open Door Baptist Church and this is your spiritual home, right? God has a place for you just as he chose, and it's our part to figure out where that actually is. That's our part. But I can tell you that God has given each of you a role and a place here. Here. Now, every church over the years, you got people coming in and out, and that's life. That's how it is. That's how it is. But while we are here, and while God has called us here, he has a place for us. And the tragedy for me is that when people come and go over the years, some leave no holes. They leave no holes. They came, they took. And when they went, there were no holes to fill. No holes to fill. Now that's not universally the case. And I'm thankful for so many that if the Lord moved them on or the Lord took them home, I pray for neither. Now, I got some deep holes. I got some deep shoes to fill, right? Be that kind of person. Serve the Lord here. You might say, I just don't know where I fit. Well, just for starters, just be available. Just be available. Availability is almost all of it. To be a Christian who is available, God can speak to that person. They're listening. They're humble. They're willing. They give things a go. And eventually, over time, they're just exactly where doing the things that God wants them to do. I got the greatest blessing as a teenager to help out in a primary Sunday school class. It was the greatest blessing. When I was 16 or 17, whenever it was, and I was in that classroom, I had that class for 10 years. I learned so many things. And after 10 years, I learned I shouldn't be teaching primary. That's what I learned. That's one lesson I learned. I really need to be teaching another class. But that's how it sort of works. You're available, and you end up where God wants you to be. Every tribe was placed where God determined. And when things are like that, you have peace, and you have effectiveness, and things work the way they should, and you have a highly functioning ministry. Go back to that last verse in Numbers 2. Go back to that last verse. Thus, the children of Israel did according to all that the Lord commanded Moses. Where can contentment come from? It comes from serving where God puts you. I said where God puts you. I like what Jerry Bridges said. He said, God does not give us his power so that we might feel good about ourselves. He gives us his power so that we can obey him for his sake and for his glory. That's why he gives us these divine enablings. The whole context of 1 Corinthians 12 is that God puts all the members in the body and he gives them gifts just like a human body functions in its own way with really, really specialised enablings like ears and hands and feet and noses. Okay, I mean, we read in 1 Corinthians 12 about the smelling. It's like the smelling. Yeah, well, see, if you can smell things, you can smell something that doesn't taste very good, can't you? You can avoid a really bad experience. I mean, you can avoid death through a good sense of smell, can you not? Toxins and stuff that's really, really dangerous, even just the smelling. Contentment comes from serving God where he puts you. And I think we have in Numbers 2 a very clear indication, even in the Old Testament, that God places his people of his own wisdom, where they need to be.